and welcome to today's webinar on reducing the risk of error in financial models. Our presenter is Danielle Steen-Fairhurst, and I'll be handing over to her in just a few moments after I run you through a few housekeeping rules. Sorry about that. The entire presentation will be available on our YouTube channel to view again at your leisure, and the slides will be available for downloading, and we will post these to our SlideShare page. Please allow up to a week for us to send these links to you. Please spare a few minutes to complete the post-webinar survey, which will pop up at the end of this session. You will notice a pop-out question box in your control panel. Please use this to type any questions you have as the webinar progresses, and Danielle will allocate time at the end to answer your questions. That all remains for me to say is thank you very much, and I'll hand you over to Danielle now.
Thank you so much, and it's really fantastic to be back here in Dubai. My name is Danielle Stein-Fairhurst, and yes, here's some information about who I am. I come over to Dubai a couple of times a year. I'm based in Sydney in Australia, but I do enjoy coming over here, and we run a financial modelling using Excel course here in Dubai, which I really enjoy. So we are now on day 2 of financial modelling using Excel here in Dubai. What I'm going to be talking about today is reducing the risk of error when you're using financial models, and that's something that we talk, it's a bit of an extract, I suppose, from our financial modelling using Excel training course. Now, I am a career financial modeler, I suppose. Financial modelling is pretty much what I do all day, every day, and I have a book on using Excel for business analysis, and the revised edition has just become available. I've just actually published some supplementary content, and I just wanted to make that available to you because I think you'll if you're interested in financial modelling, you'll be able to have a look at some of the examples. Now, we're going to make the slides that I'm going to talk through with you today, we're going to make those available to you. And also there's a couple of Excel files that I'd like to sort of describe or go through with you. I mean, it's very hard to talk about Excel without actually showing you the programs. So I've got a couple of sample files I'd like to show you. So that's actually, it's going to probably take a week to get those files up, and by that stage you may have forgotten about them. So what I'm going to do is just show you how to download these files if you'd like to. So I'm just going to click on this link here. So the URL is plumsolutions.com.au/book. So if I click on that, hopefully that's going to take me to the site. And while you guys have got a minute, you might like to download these files. So just the very first URL there, the link, supplementary online materials. And you can see there's a whole pile of loads and loads of different content, lots of examples. Now, the 2 files that I'm going to be referring to today is Chapter 4. If you'd like to take a minute to just open up that file, and you'll be able to, it's only a very small file, so it won't take terribly long. That one there, the Chapter 4 one, and then I'll also talk a little bit about some scenarios. So I'm just going to scroll right the way down to the very bottom here. Chapter 11, Scenario Tools. That's the other one I'm going to be referring to. So if you want to just take a moment to download those 2 files, and then you'll be able to follow along with me. If you can't get access to it, don't worry too much about it. Just again, the URL was plumsolutions.com.au/book. So go to that URL there. And then once you're on that page, if you scroll down and go to the very first link, supplementary online materials, there's loads of free content that you can download and have a look through at your leisure. So the 2 files that we're going to be using today is Chapter 4, and scrolling down again, we'll go to Chapter 11, Scenario Tools. So those are the two files that I'm going to be referring to. If you don't get to do it, don't worry about it. You can just follow along. If you missed it, that's okay. We'll be sending those files through to you at a later date. If you've registered for this webinar, you'll get an email with a recording and a link with all the files as well. So don't worry about that too much. Okay, let's get into it. So let's talk about financial modelling. I mean, we're going to be talking about financial modelling in the context of using Excel. So probably one of the biggest things that modelers worry about is the possibility that there could be a mistake in your financial model, and it's probably one of the most career damaging things that can happen to a financial modeler. I know it's there's absolutely nothing worse than having that sort of feeling of perhaps your numbers being wrong. And we said there's basically three types of financial model error that you possibly could find. Number one is a formula error. You know, you could possibly get a dollar sign in the wrong place, or you know, the formula is looking at the wrong cell, or your links are a little bit out of whack or something like that. Formula errors are pretty horrible. They're very embarrassing. Basically, they're really embarrassing to get a formula error in your financial model, because they're very easy to make, but they're also very easy to fix, and they're very embarrassing. So there are certain things that we're going to be going through on this webinar today which are going to try to help reduce the possibility for this to happen. So there's ways that you can build your model, techniques that you can use as you're building your formulas and as you're structuring your model to try to reduce the possibility of this happening. Number two is errors in your assumptions or your inputs. That's pretty hard to identify. As a modeler, you may not know whether your assumptions are correct or not. So you really need to make it, basically all you can do as a modeler is to just make it very clear what those assumptions are, so the person using the model is able to, you know, verify for themselves whether those assumptions are correct or not. And lastly, a logic error can also be very difficult to identify. We often find that a logic mistake is very difficult to find. It's really to do, I've got some examples which I'll show you, but it's very easy to say, well, you know, this multiplied by this gives you that, but then you sort of forgot to take into account something else. So logic errors are probably the most difficult to find and identify. So what I'm going to be taking you through today is 10 strategies that I found that really help you to reduce the possibility for errors in your financial model. So firstly, we're going to talk about some techniques when you're building your financial model. And number one is using the enter key. So while you're actually building the model, get into the habit of using the enter key rather than just clicking somewhere else. Now, that might be a little bit difficult to visualize, so I'm going to just flick over to Excel now and show you what I mean by that. What I'm going to do is just go to Chapter 4, so the Excel file that I showed you on Chapter 4. If you've been able to download that, great. And we'll just go over to the second tab along, which is called Figure 4.2. And this is an example. This is a screenshot of what it looks like in the book in Figure 4.2. But what I'm talking about here is that you've finished editing a formula. And what I often see people do is that they finished editing the formula and then they just click somewhere else. And that's a really poor practice. So normally, you know, you should finish editing your formula like that. You might be putting in some dollar signs or something, and you should hit the enter key. Or, just going back into it, you could hit the tick here to enter it. Now, the reason that that's important is that you're being really deliberate about what goes into your formula or what goes into your model. What I've seen some people do is that they scroll down and then they click somewhere else. And what that means is that they haven't looked at what they've just entered into the formula. So your first line of defense against errors in your financial model is to finish building your formula, hit the enter key, does it look right, and does it look sensible? So to be constantly self-checking, self-correcting as you build those formulas. That's the first reason. And secondly, every now and then, most of the time you get away with it if you click somewhere else, but sometimes every now and then that can happen, and you can cause an error. So that's the other reason we say not to click somewhere else. So it is important to use the enter key. So that's your first line of defense against errors in your financial model, is to always get into the habit of using the enter key. Secondly, after you hit the enter key, look at the formula. That is probably going to be the easiest way to pick up mistakes or formula mistakes as you're building your model. We make mistakes all the time. People are constantly making mistakes, and you really just need to pick it up yourself. So as you hit the enter key, look at the formula. Does it look right? Does it look sensible? To be constantly checking the formula as you put it in. I tend to work with a big offline calculator next to me, and then when I finished editing the formula, I look at the value, I calculate it manually, say, does it look right? Does it look sensible? So that's really going to help you pick it up. When you've finished checking it, check it again. So we say fill in the block of data and then go back and do a bit of a sense check and use a calculator if you need to, if you can't work it out in your head. So just going back to that example that I was showing you before, so I'll just make this a little bit bigger. So just going into it here, if I go in now, one of the points of best practice in financial modelling is to have consistent formulas all the way along. So I'm just going to use my F4 shortcut now. So this is something we were doing in our financial modelling course yesterday. So we just go into the formula, go F2, go in, and I've gone into my F4, keep hitting my F4, and so I'm going to anchor my column A and then go over to this one here, 3. Put another $sign in there, and I'm just going to copy it like that. So I've got consistent formulas all the way across, and I'm going to look at it. Does it look right? Does it look sensible? Use my F2, and I'm going to just check that it's picking up the right formulas. Yep, okay, do a bit of a spot check to make sure that the formulas are correct. So check it yourself, check it 3 times, and make sure that it's giving you the result that you expect. After you've checked it 3 times, get someone else to check your work. I used to have a bit of a deal going with one of my colleagues. So I'd say, look, because I tell you, it's really not the most interesting part of financial modelling. It's much more fun to create your own financial models, checking somebody else's models. It's really not the sexy part of financial modelling. So it's a good idea to sort of have somebody else check your models. And when you're explaining the model and the model structure and the way that the formulas has been calculated, when you're explaining it to someone else, it can help you to flush out some of those errors. So once you've checked your work a couple of times, get somebody else to check it before it gets published or before it goes to anybody else, before it goes to your manager or before it goes off to a client. So that's usually a really good idea. Next one is to document and to validate those assumptions. So really a financial model is only as good as the assumptions that go into it. You can have a really fantastic financial model that works really, really well, but if it's garbage in, garbage out. If the assumptions that go into that model are rubbish, then the outcome is going to be rubbish as well. So you really need to be sure that those assumptions are documented and that they're absolutely correct. So make it very, very clear in the design and the layout of your financial model that those assumptions, so that whatever the assumptions for the model is, that it's very clear for the user to see what those assumptions are. Next is to document your methodology. Now this will really flush out any sort of errors. Probably mostly with, as I said, logic errors are quite difficult to pick up. So this is an example for a business case that we were working on today, actually, in our financial modelling using Excel business case. So part of our assessment with George Washington University is that we need to, the delegates who are on my training course today need to create a business case. So this is the way that we've calculated the customers, what we expect our customers to be. We take the total population, we multiply it. It's a pet insurance product. You'd multiply it by the pet ownership assumptions, which gives you your potential market. We then apply a take-up rate, which gives us the number of customers required. So that's an example of what a flow chart for some methodology or the logic of a financial model might be. Now that's something that if you're going to present a financial model to a group, you might create a flowchart that looks like this, or you could just use it as part of the documentation as part of your financial model. So documenting the methodology is a really good way to identify logic errors and just to make sure that your calculation or your methodology, the way that you're calculating things, is sound. So next is stress testing. So stress testing is something that once you've finished, we'll talk a bit about scenarios, sensitivities. Stress testing should not be confused with scenarios and sensitivity analysis. Stress testing means that we stress the model. We put some ridiculous inputs. So for example, if you're doing an example earlier, we did a customer take-up rate. If you put your number of customers to 0, obviously that's not going to happen. Then you would expect the number of customers at the end to also be 0. If you put your price to 0, then your revenue should be 0. If it's not, you'd like to know why. Or let's say if you were to double your number of customers, would you also find that your revenue would double as well, for example? So some other examples that you might look at, if you're looking at staff costs, you might double the headcount. You would expect the staff cost to double. Or if you're doing some escalation or some inflation amounts, you could actually change your growth rate to 0. So you would expect that the forecast would then remain absolutely flat. Similarly, it's not a bad idea to chart, to actually look at your data visually. And often you can do some metrics, some calculations. So look at the cost that it is incurred by each customer. So look at the total customer cost, divide it by the number of customers, or look at the price per unit. And does that remain constant, or what does it look like visually? Let me show you an example here. This is a file that I actually don't have available on the site, so you'll have to wait for this one. This is just a very simple model. So we're basically saying we've got forecast number of customers, and this is growing. We've got some assumptions here, so I can see that I've got some growth. If I want to have a look at any of my named ranges, of course, I can just go to my little name box in here and I can see all of my assumptions behind here. So that's all fine in there. And I can see there that's increasing by core growth. If I wanted to see what core growth was, I could click on there and I can see that the monthly core growth is 1%. Okay, that's all fine. I can then say number of calls per day. Then I can calculate the number of calls per month, which will give us the revenue. Now I've got some expenses which look like they're fairly flat. Now if I wanted to check for the sensibleness, I suppose, of my model here to make sure that it's looking reasonable, what I could do is calculate my revenue per customer, not because I need it, but just because I want to check that it makes sense, that there's no sort of anomalies there. So if I say the revenue divided by the number of customers, I can then just copy that across, all the way across. And I can see there that, okay, it fluctuates a little bit. That one's down quite low. And I just look at that and see, does it look right? Does it look sensible? I could even go in and just have a look at what that looks like visually. I don't necessarily save these charts, but it's just quite nice to see what that looks like visually. We're used to looking at numbers all day, every day, but you really get a picture of what's going on a lot better if you're able to visually look at that and see what it's doing. I can see there's a little bit of a blip there, but other than that, it's reasonably flat, which is what I would expect from this model. So if I look at that number there, let's sort of try and get under that. So we say the revenue is quite low. Okay, so the reason for that, not sure. I'll have a look at that and see what that might be. So we're saying a number of calls per day. Okay, it could be something to do with the number of days in the month, perhaps. So you can see the number of calls per month is quite low there. If I go to my formulas here, go into trace precedence, double click on there and go to my assumptions. Yes, so that explains it actually. So you can look at the number of business days per month, and I can see there that that's actually got a very low number of days. There's obviously a number of public holidays perhaps in that month, so that's why it's low. So what you could do actually, you could, just going back to what I had done, this would actually make sense, would be to put that like that. And then what I could do is just go in and select data, add a new series. It'd be quite interesting to look at the days. If I just add that in there, see if this is going to work. I haven't tried this before, but I think this makes sense. See what that looks like. Yeah, you can see there's a little bit of a blip there. If I click on that, now if I'm using, because I'm using Excel 2013, there's actually a really nice chart type that I can use. If I go into a combo chart, you can see there that looks quite nice. Actually, I think the number of days is going to look better as a column. I'm just going to move those around, change that to a chart, and I'm going to pop that onto a second. Yeah, that looks okay. Yeah, I think that actually looks quite sensible. I can see that the number of days and the price per unit is does actually look quite sensible. What I'll do is I'll just leave that there, and so that when we send out a copy of this file, I'll just move that down, tidy it up, so that you guys will have a copy of what I've done here. So this is revenue per customer versus days per month, and that's really going to explain what the problem is. I'm not using my laptop here, I'm getting a few of the keys wrong. I always like to change the colors. It's always nice to change my standard colors. That looks nice. I'll go with something like that. That looks good. And then just looking at what's across the x-axis there, I'm just going to go into select data, edit, and change the months across the bottom. Yeah, hasn't actually got the months, but that's okay. So that kind of explains what's going on in this model. So that's quite nice, just to have that as a bit of backup in our financial model. So I'll save a copy of that and send that out as part of the webinar. So that's an example of the kind of things that you could do to stress test or to chart and to sense check and make sure that there aren't any mistakes or errors or any sort of underlying anomalies in your financial model. So the next thing is to look at some scenarios and sensitivity analysis. So that I'll show you an example of what they are. So there's different ways of doing scenarios and sensitivities. We sometimes use the word scenarios and sensitivities simultaneously, or interchangeably, I mean. But basically sensitivity analysis means, what if I changed one single input, if I changed inflation, for example, or if I changed growth rate, or I changed cost per square meter, how does that affect the output of our model? A scenario would be something like, what would happen if this goes up, that goes down, and this stays the same. So there's a bit of a difference between scenarios and sensitivity analysis. But by applying scenarios and sensitivities, that can really help you to understand what's going on in your financial model and can flush out any inconsistencies. So just going over to, just going back to the Excel files, just going to the Chapter 11 one. So there, I've got 3 files open at the moment. There's the Chapter 4 one that I demonstrated with the when I was doing the clicking on the error. Then there's the example, which I'll send through to you. And now lastly, I'm looking at Chapter 11 scenario 2. So I just wanted to show you an example of what a scenario would look like. So let's say, for example, we've got base case, and you can see that the numbers will change. We'll say worst case, well, they should change. Let me have a look to see if my calculations perhaps are not on. If I go into my options, my calculations are on. So we should see the numbers change. So when you change the drop down, the numbers, there we go, sorry. If you had some formulas in there, my formulas have dropped off. Let me just quickly pop those in if I do a very quick VLOOKUP, just to fix this up. And if I go to best case, what you should see here is, I'll just do a quick VLOOKUP, go to that one, 2 and a 0. It's my F4 to put in my dollar signs, like that. So that's now going to be a formula that will change. And then I'll just change that, just drag that over and change that to a 3. There we go. Okay, so now that I've got some formulas in there, my scenarios will change. So I'll change that to base case, and you can see the numbers are changing because I could have used an if statement, or I could have used a SUMIF formula. I chose a VLOOKUP in this particular situation. So this is something that you could do. This is an example of the kind of scenario analysis that you can create. So it shows you how to create drop-down boxes, and you can work through some of these examples here. I will send through a copy of the completed versions of these models, so you'll be able to see the formula that I've just built in there. So that's an example of a scenario or sensitivity analysis that you could use to check, to make sure that there's no problems in your financial models. Next, you should take note of your Excel errors. Now, I know some of these errors strike terror into a modeler's heart. I'm seeing nobody likes to see these kind of errors in their financial models. They're pretty horrible. But we do often see errors like that. Take note of them. Don't ignore them. Don't just suppress them. You can quite easily go in and use an if error function that will suppress those. Try not to do that. Sometimes it's necessary, but generally your errors are trying to tell you something. So just take note of the errors. Try to make sure that they're not telling you that there's something wrong with it. Don't just ignore them or delete the cell. I would much rather see an error or an error value like this than actually seeing a number that looks like it possibly could be right, but in fact it's completely wrong. We always say the worst thing, the only thing worse than finding a mistake in your model is not finding a mistake in the model. And I'd much rather see a horrible, ugly error like this than to see a number that looks like it could be right, but in fact it's completely wrong. And of course, the only thing worse than finding or not finding the mistake in your model is your boss finding the mistake in your model. So we want to make sure that something like that doesn't happen. So different kinds of errors that you can get. Circular references. If you managed to open up the file for Chapter 4, you would have noticed there was a bit of an error, like a warning to say that there was a circular reference, and that's intentional. That circular reference is in there just to demonstrate what a circular reference looks like. So when you open up that file, it will give you a warning to say that there's a circular reference, and that's okay in this particular instance because I created that deliberately to show you what one looked like. But normally, if you see a circular reference in a model, you should just stop what you're doing. just undo whatever you just did, close without saving. You really can't have a financial model that has a circular reference in it. There's a few situations, if I go over to the next slide, a really common problem when it comes to financial modelling with interest and financial statements. Quite often we have a link between the P&L and the cash flow and the balance sheet. When you're creating the three different financial statements, we often find that the interest amount is an input into the P&L, and so whatever is left over, so the profitability from the profit and loss statement becomes an input into the cash flow, and then that in turn drives the loan amount. So depending on how much profit there is, that will drive how much you need to borrow, which will then drive the interest, which will then drive the P&L, which will then drive the cash flow. So you end up with this lovely circular reference in interest calculation. So don't ignore that. You need to get around it somehow. I know some modelers do enable iterative calculations, and if that works for you, great. I generally don't recommend it. I find circular references can be pretty horrible to deal with, so I'd probably prefer to either get around it mathematically. What we often do is we base our interest rate based on the cash balance of the prior month. That's not entirely accurate, but it certainly gets around the circular references. Or alternatively, you can use a macro to get around that problem. So don't ignore, just going back one slide, don't ignore Excel errors, and certainly don't ignore circular references, because that means that Excel is calculating on itself somehow. If I can just go to your chapter 4, just going back to that chapter 4 slide there, if I go over to the circular reference, just find the file, that would be this one here. So here is a very simple example. You can see here circular references at the bottom there to say B11, and you can see that I've included B11 on itself. So that's an example of a very simple circular reference. Usually circular references are a lot more complicated than that. There's something is calculating on itself. I could have found that circular reference actually if I had gone an easier way to find it. What I should have done is gone to here, go to error checking circular references, and you can see there that will take me directly to the circular reference. So the next one is looking at some error checks. So a good financial modeler will always look for opportunities to include error checks in your financial model. Checks will identify the errors in the inputs. They're generally not going to help you, particularly when you're building the financial model, but an error check will help the user of a financial model. If somebody were to enter a result that is invalid, or if they misuse the model, or it's not adding up for whatever reason, the error check will identify it. What it won't help, it doesn't help if you're not using good modelling practice. So error checks are not a substitute for good financial modelling practice. So let me show you an example now of error checks. If I go back to your chapter 4, here's an example of an error check. So it's on figure 4.11. If you can find that tab, you can see here we've got some printing here. So this total here, you can see at the bottom there it's 34,100, and this total here is 140,085. So that's the total there, and so this number here should be the same as the other. So I've just used a simple error check to say if the total of all of those does not equal that, give me an error, otherwise give me a 0. So like, for example, if somebody were to enter something incorrectly, if this were, adding up something like that, it will automatically pick up and give us an error. Something else you can do is I often put error checks right throughout the model, and it can be quite hard to identify those. So what we often do is just have an error check page, and I often just hide that at the back of your model. And then, after the model's been in use for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or even a couple of years, when the model comes back to me, I can just unhide, just go in and hide or unhide this particular sheet, and I can see a list of all the different error checks that are within the model, and then just used a simple COUNTIF to say, hey, there's an error there, and you can click and you can see it link back to wherever your error check is. So that's something that you should get into the habit of using error checks within your financial models. So those are the 10 strategies that you can use for reducing the risk of error in your financial models. So just in summary, use the Enter key, get into the habit of always using the Enter key, don't click somewhere else, check your work. So when you've finished editing your formula, check it and then check it again. Make sure that you sense check it, and once you've checked it 3 times, have somebody else check it. So those are things the techniques that you should get into the habit of using to reduce the possibility of errors in your model. The next one is to validate those assumptions. Make sure that it's very clear what assumptions you've used, so that if there are any mistakes in the assumptions, it's very clear and easy to see. You should document your methodology, make it very clear the methodology that's been used. Don't make it so that the person reviewing your model has to get inside the workings and the calculations that you've done. Make it very clear what that methodology is, the way that you've calculated things. The next one is stress testing. Go in and make sure that the model is working properly by putting in some crazy inputs and crazy numbers that can identify if something's wrong. Sensitivities and scenario analysis can flush out if there's any problems in your model. Take note of the errors in your financial model. Don't ignore them. And lastly, always look for opportunities to build error checks into your models. So that's pretty much it of what I wanted to go over with you today in the webinar. If there are any questions, please type it into your little box on the screen, and I'll take those questions now. So just type in if there's anything that you'd like to know. Feel free to drop me a line afterwards. We'll certainly make this all available to you. Yes, Cole's got a suggestion there. Cole says that to recommend that you feed the results of the error check page, so the overall status, back to the top left of every sheet, so that the status of the model integrity is always visible. That's a really good. That's actually a really good suggestion, Cole. So what Cole is saying is that remember when I showed you the page that had saying that there is an error check in there. It will, and having it on every single page so that you can't miss it. That's actually a really good point, not a bad idea to implement. Uma has got a question about the becoming a certified financial modeller. We do have financial modelling using Excel, which is a certified course, which is actually running again we're running it in October, I think is the next time we're running it. So we'd love to see you there. I'm sure that Informa will be able to provide you with some more information on that if you would like to get in touch with them. Yeah, Cole has got a comment on using data validation to prevent errors occurring in the first place. That will certainly, data validation, I didn't really talk about that, but using the drop-down box, like we did with the scenario analysis, will stop people from entering in incorrect inputs. That's true. It won't help you when you're building the model, but it can certainly help users. That's a really good idea. Paul's got, Paul has made the suggestion that using round for error checks. That's true, because Excel actually truncates at 14 decimal places. So quite often when you calculate something one way and then you calculate something the other way, it can be 0.000 something out, and it will give you a false error. So we often use, a rounding formula will work. Alternatively, what I often use is an ABS, or an absolute value. So an ABS, so the absolute value of one cell minus the other. If the So if that's greater than 1, for example, give me the error, otherwise not. So that's a good point, thank you. Uma's got another question about the modelling course, so we'll might get back to you on that one separately, Uma, if that's okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there for today. So we'll certainly make all of this available to you. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. It's been fantastic being here again, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.